Great to see a new Australian documentary called 20 to the Mile, the story of the Overland Telegraph. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of 20 to the Mile, Andrew Hyde. Andrew, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Peter, thank you for having me.
Such an interesting and informative documentary. I learned so much because I didn't know a great deal about the way, for example, that 20 to the mile meant 20 telegraph poles to the mile in South Australia, Northern Territory, etc. Tell me all about how this documentary first came about.
Well, it came about essentially through the historian Derek Pugh, who you've seen presenting the film. Derek wrote the what I would say is the definitive history of the Overland Telegraph in his book, which is called 20 to the Mile. And he was just completing that book as the 150th anniversary of the joining of the line was coming together. And he got in touch with me. I've done some films on Northern Australian history before. He came to me and said, listen, I think this would be a great documentary. We hadn't worked together before. And so we sat down and had a look at the story. I was aware of the Overland Telegraph because I've grown up in the Northern Territory, but a lot of the detail I wasn't aware of. And so we went on that journey together, and it was fantastic.
Well, congratulations on making this film because, as I said, it's so informative. Tell me about
Thank you.
tell me about the research that went into it, especially because there is so much archival footage, photos, and of course Derek and so on. It's so interesting the way you put it together.
Well, I was lucky, really, in that Derek came to me with the manuscript for his book, and essentially the research to a large extent was done in terms of the story, at least. And one of the benefits we had with this project, and really one of the reasons we were able to get it off the ground, was thanks to a gentleman by the name of Captain Samuel Sweet, who was a captain of a ship that went between Darwin and the Roper River delivering supplies to the Overland Telegraph, and he happened to have a stills camera with him. Now, this is 1870, 71. It's pretty early days for photography. Certainly, photography wasn't really a particularly mobile art form at that particular point in time. So he had this big glass plate camera with him on board. And as luck would have it, he was at all of the key moments in the establishment of the line, and he took photographs, one at a time sort of thing. It wasn't like he was banging off a roll of film. But we've got these photographs there. The glass plates are actually in the State Library of South Australia. So we were able to access those at very high resolution, and that gave us some material to work with, which makes life so much easier when you're telling these historical stories and you don't have images. Yeah, obviously it's that much harder. So, it's intriguing that Darwin, for example, has had a camera present pretty much from day one, which is unusual for a modern city or for a city of that era and preceding. So, yeah, we had those photographs, we had the manuscript for the book, we were off and running.
Well done on that. That's a fantastic sort of backstory and background to it all. And how easy was it to get funding and to produce the film? Because it's never easy to produce any films in Australia, I suppose.
It's never easy, and really, the model that exists in Australia is fundamentally about having a broadcaster or a streamer on board as early as possible. Easier said than done. And we didn't have one on board in the early stages, and so we were lucky that we found a little bit of screen agency funding in the development stages, which helped us get moving. And we had some commercial support, and also the two production companies that produced the film had a lot of resources themselves in terms of filming resources, post-production facilities, and so forth. So the producers were able to give a fair bit of their time to the project just to see it through, which is what we did, and we got enough money to make it happen. I mean, it's certainly not by any stretch of the imagination a cash cow, but we got there in the end.
Well, well done on that. I mean, it's very well shot, and of course, with your background in making other documentaries and so on, I read you must have been very careful about the way you wanted to present the story.
Yeah, well, I was the cinematographer as well as the director,
Mm.
and we did do it on the smell of an oily rag to a large extent. Very small crew. We drove the entire length of the line in three attempts, in three stages, if you will. And the key to it really was to get to each of those locations at the right time of day so that we could be filming, in the golden hour, as the phrase goes. And a lot of those locations, particularly in northern South Australia, in the desert country out near Unadada, they come to life in that last hour of the day. And it's magical. So that was really our objective. But yeah, small crew. A lot of the time there was only four of us, maybe five on the road. Um, in a convoy of three vehicles, basically retracing the line. Amazing.
It is amazing, and as I said, people will learn a great deal about this story. I mean, to think that it would you have to wait for a ship to receive any messages, and of course, as soon as the overland telegraph was established, it only took about 7 hours.
That's absolutely right. Yes, it's. I mean, it's impossible to comprehend, isn't it? The idea that international news would take weeks to reach Australian shores.
Hmm.
So, I mean, take an event such as, I don't know, a monarch dying, for example, back in the UK, and we wouldn't be aware of it in Australia for at least 7 weeks.
Hmm.
So, with the establishment of the line and the connection of the line from Darwin through to Java, that became ours. So it revolutionized commerce, it revolutionized news, government, I mean, everything. It revolutionized society. Probably, and in that sense, perhaps was one of the pivotal moments in Australian history, certainly in European Australian history, if I can use that phrase. Um, a remarkable change to all corners of society.
Yes, and 1872 is when it was launched. So it's amazing to think how technology has developed since then, but how it had to develop up until then to be able to have this telegraph system.
Yeah, we refer to it in the film as being, the building of the overland telegraph being the equivalent to, the arrival of the internet
Hmm.
in terms of its impact on society. But one of the things I find really amazing is, they built this thing, but they had the capacity very quickly to find faults in the line under the ocean. So and in fact, when the line was connected, there was a fault between Darwin and Java, and there was a slight delay. So at that point, Darwin could talk to Adelaide, but they couldn't talk to London because there was a fault somewhere under the ocean. The ship simply went out with divers and electricians and found the fault, pulled the cable up, fixed it, and put it back down on the seafloor again, which in 1872 is pretty remarkable.
Very remarkable. That is so interesting to hear. Tell me about the people who are interviewed in the film, because there's lots of great stories, and I can imagine they had lots to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges for the film was to present the story from a First Nations perspective. The filmmakers aren't First Nations, so we needed to be very sensitive about that. We have an academic, Don Christopherson, in the project who is Indigenous, who's done a lot of work on the impact of European arrival on First Nations Australians through Northern Territory, particularly, and he talks a lot about how it was there were wins and losses in the situation that the telegraph stations, once they were established, became real beacons in the middle of the continent and places where supplies could be gathered and medical help could be found and so on. But there are also conflicts along the way, and these are stories that need to be revisited and considered in context. So we had some experts along the way who were able to give us some of that context.
That is excellent to hear because yes, I was so interested in the First Nations perspective and how that all fitted together. It's yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
So uh, obviously the various telegraph stations that you visit are in various stages in terms of whether they've been looked after or not or whatever, and that in itself is so interesting because we don't know a great deal about these stations.
Yeah, if you're looking north of about Tennant Creek, you'll find it harder and harder to find anything left, and that's essentially because of the wear and tear of the wet seasons. 150 wet seasons, and termites as well. Termites in the tropical north are pretty aggressive. But if you get down Alice Springs and then back towards Port Augusta, there's some remarkable sites that are actually not that difficult to access. And you'll find these telegraph stations just sort of very, very quietly dissolving into the sand. But very evocative, provocative places to visit, that's for sure.
Absolutely, and again, you present that so well. So, with all the footage that you shot, first of all, how long overall was the shoot?
Well, actually, that's a very good question. We realized the first screening that we did in Darwin of the film, we talked about how remarkable it was that they constructed the overland telegraph in under 2 years, just over 18 months. They built the whole thing from Port Augusta to Darwin. And we realized it had taken us 3 years to make the film. So it actually took us longer to make the film than it did for those guys to do what they had to do. So we were a little embarrassed by that. So your answer is from go to were about 3 years to
Uh,
make the film,
I
which,
lo
as you know, in the documentary world is actually not that long.
I agree, absolutely right. But I love the irony of the the telegraph being quicker to put together
Yeah,
than the film.
yeah. We're driving across the countryside in air-conditioned vehicles and sleeping in air-conditioned hotel rooms and having a lovely time, and it still took us a year longer.
Oh, I love that. That's a great story in itself. When you do the DVD release or whatever, you should have the making of and all that other extra stuff.
Yeah, we creative types clearly don't move as quickly as the engineering types, that's for sure.
Now, the documentary, and we'll talk about 20 to the mile, is a pretty tight 72 minutes. But of course, you shot much more than that. Tell me about the difficult decisions in the editing process.
Yeah, there's always decisions to be made in the editing process. And it's interesting that the version that you've seen is 72 minutes. And that's partly because we're hedging our bets a little bit as producers as to whether this will end up being a broadcast hour or a feature documentary. And feature docs are normally 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And the way things are looking now, it looks like it will stream as a feature documentary. And so we will extend it a little bit, which is great news. So some elements will come back into the story that aren't currently there. So
Ah,
I'm pleased to say.
that's great. What are some examples of what will go back into the doco if it's 90 minutes?
Well, I think we probably leapt through the last stages of the building of the line, which is essentially the stage from sort of Catherine to Darwin. And we did that again because we were a little bit short of anything still being out there in the bush. The wet seasons kind of have gotten rid of everything, and
Mm.
we'd like to go back and look at that section of the story in a bit more detail. One of the things that happened as a result of the line was gold was discovered near Pine Creek, and the Northern Territory's gold rush kicked off, which brought in literally tens of thousands of people into the what was at that point a fledgling Northern Territory. A big Chinese population emerged around the Pine Creek area. Those things we haven't touched on a lot in the film. And the other thing is we've got some incredible diaries from the wives of the telegraph station, the head telegraph guys. Once the line was up and running, some families came out to some of those stations. We touched on a couple of those diaries in the film that you've seen, but I'd like to expand on that because some of their stories of raising children and families out in areas that were probably as remote as anything in the empire at that point in time are truly fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. And another interesting aspect of the story is the politics and the funding involved in building the telegraph, because obviously there were some disputes between states and territories and between various politicians about who was going to pay for it.
Very much so, and beyond that, there was this sort of three-way tussle with South Australia, who essentially had control of the Northern Territory at that point, and then Queensland, and then Victoria. The Victorians sent Burke and Wills up to the Gulf of Carpentaria to find a track that ultimately could be used for the overland telegraph. Of course, that mission was a bit of a disaster. Queensland had an alternative proposal. They'd built a railhead to Normanton, which is on the Gulf of Carpentaria, on the western side of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and their plan was to run the line from Normanton to Java. And believe it or not, that is a shorter line than the Adelaide to Darwin line.
Mm.
So they nearly won the day. Now, had they won the day, the modern map of the Northern Territory would look very different, because you've got to remember that as a result of the Overland Telegraph, you got the communities of Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Catherine, even Port Darwin had just established when the line was open, but was, its future was by no means certain. So it may very well be that had Queensland won the day, we'd have a large city at Normanton, and Darwin and Alice Springs perhaps wouldn't exist in their current forms at all. So the map of Australia would look quite different.
That is so interesting to hear, and yeah, I'm glad you clarified that because I was interested in how that came up in the documentary and so on. The other thing I wanted to mention is the use of graphics in your documentary. Tell me about that because it looks really great.
Oh, thank you. Well, the animator will be very pleased to hear that. It's a big wide country. I mean, I think we all have kind of a rough geographical sense of where Alice Springs is and where Port Augusta is and so on. But when you're considering it from the point of view of these groups of construction workers on horseback slowly working their way through the interior of the country, and the only European who had seen that country previously was John McDale Stewart and his team. They were the only ones that had been through the region. So it was a complete unknown. The construction teams were essentially explorers as well. And so I guess the maps just kind of help, link those locations together and link that sense of that tyranny of distance. As does the aerial photography. There's a lot of drone photography in this
Mm.
film. And in fact, when we had our first look at it, the producers, one of the producers said, we didn't realize it, but the outback becomes a character in the film in its own way. And so I guess the graphics just sort of help create that sense of scale.
It does. It does. No, it all looks great. Now, I'm intrigued because I think your film, 20 to the Mile, has screened in a few places. Tell me about trying to roll the film out. And then, of course, eventually you said it's going onto a streaming platform.
Yeah, well, in the first instance, we really wanted to do a screening in Darwin because, the story is obviously central to Darwin, and there are lots of people in the Darwin community, first of all, that helped us with the film. We had some crowdfunding, and that was extremely important. And second of all, they were just, they know their history. So that's a good test case. You can get a theatre together of people who actually know their stuff. It'll test the whole concept out a little bit. So we did a screening in Darwin at the iconic deck chair cinema here, which was a full house, which was I think around 450, and in fact was such a full house that we had to do a second screen the following week and sold that out as well. So we figured, well, that's a pretty good start. And then last week we were in Melbourne for the Australian International Documentary Conference, which is an annual event. And so we took the opportunity to do a screening out at the Sun Theatre in Yarraville. And that was a successful night too. That's a great old theatre. And we had a very good and enthusiastic crowd out there, which was lovely. Yeah, as a result of the documentary conference, we do have a streamer coming on board. I can't yet say who it is.
Ah,
We're in that stage of, all the
sure.
contractual stuff. But yes, it is happening, and people will be able to stream the film fairly soon, which is great news.
That is great news because it's so important that films like yours are out there and that people can see them. It's so important. Okay, look, congratulations on that. I want to ask you too a bit about the music that's used in the film.
Uh, yes. Well, what can I tell you? The music is subscription music.
Ah, I thought it might be public domain music. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, we would have
Yeah.
loved to have had a composer come in and compose for the project. We didn't have the
Yeah.
budget for that.
Yeah.
So it's all subscription music. But having said that, we spent a lot of time sourcing something that we felt was evocative and suitable to the subject matter. But yeah, it's all out there in the public domain, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, no, that's fair enough. I absolutely understand. And with the screenings that you've had, what sort of responses, reactions, questions, comments have you received?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've had Q&As at the end of the three screenings with Derek Pugh and myself, and certainly in Melbourne, I think 95% of the audience stayed for the full Q&A. So, I guess we're appealing to a demographic that is interested in history and is okay with history being told in what I would describe as more of a traditional documentary. History docs aren't very sexy in the marketplace, and so documentary makers are often very encouraged to find contemporary ways to tell stories. And I think sometimes with history that can have a negative impact, can kind of, dare I say it, dumb it down a little bit.
Hmm.
And because I wasn't under any commercial pressure from any broadcasters with this project, I didn't feel the need to do that. I felt that we could tell it in a very straight um, travel odyssey kind of fashion, very traditional kind of fashion. And subsequently, I found with the Q&As that people were very engaged. They were very interested in the history. They were very interested in the impact on First Nations Australians. The screenings we did came out around the time of the referendum, so there was a lot of debate going on in the public. Um, some very informed, very interesting questions, lots of thinking about what Australia would look like had it gone through Queensland or had
Hmm.
things been done differently. Um, yeah, very informed audiences, which is encouraging.
That is very encouraging, and that's great. And it's so important. We need to know more about our history, and filmmakers like yourself are doing such a great service so that we know more about it.
Yeah, and the streamers have given us an opportunity to do that. We can make films like this perhaps a little bit less expensively, but perhaps with less commercial pressure. So, we can actually just get on with telling the story and not worrying so much about having to appeal to a mass audience.
Hmm.
Which so much content that's produced in Australia is produced with that commercial reality hanging over its head. And I quite enjoyed the fact that I didn't have that pressure, although it would have been nice to have a little more money.
Hmm.
That's the give and take.
I perfectly understand that. So, is there a website people can go to so they can find out when the film will be streamed and so on?
Yes, yes, indeed, there is. 20tothemile.com.au is out there. You'll also find links to Derek's book there. Derek Pugh has written 15 books on Northern Australia, Northern Australian history. He's prolific. He's just actually this week released another one on the 50th anniversary of Cyclone Tracy, which is this year. So Derek's books are worth checking out on that website. And you can also find the 20 to the Mile Facebook page, which is being updated quite frequently. And we'll have some news regarding the streaming on those platforms shortly.
Excellent to hear that. And last question I love asking, well, there's two last questions. One is what you're working on next. And I think I saw in your credits when I looked at IMDb, Tracy came up.
Yeah, so yeah, 50 years on Christmas Day this year since Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin.
Yeah.
Darwin's history is really unusual. There's a city, it's been destroyed 4 times. Cyclone Tracy was the last time. Previous to that was the Japanese bombings in the Second World War, and then a cyclone in the 1930s and a cyclone in the 1890s
Ah.
destroyed the place. But nothing really compares with Cyclone Tracy 1974. And I'm doing a two-part series for Channel 9 exploring that event, which we're just starting to work on now. Fascinating
Oh,
and very
excellent.
emotional.
Yes, I can imagine it would be. And I'm sure you'll find some great archival footage too.
It's extraordinary. I've grown up very aware of Cyclone Tracy, and I've seen the images my whole life, really.
Mm.
But to actually sit in the edit suite and start to work through the archive and to see, a city of, as it was at the time, 50,000 people, completely flattened, 80% of houses destroyed. It's just remarkable stuff. Harrowing still 50 years later.
I am looking forward to your two-part series already. I think it's going to be great. So well done, Andrew.
Thank you. I'll keep you informed on that one.
Okay. And last question, are there any particular filmmakers or films that may have influenced you or documentaries or whatever that you look up to?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, there's a two-part answer to that. The first is I'm just old enough to remember the what I would call well, they were almost rogue filmmakers of the 1970s. I'm thinking Albie Mangles and Malcolm Douglas, and even the Leyland brothers, bless them, and the stripped back, low key, low budget filmmaking that those guys did back in those days. I remember seeing Albie's films at the drive-in, and I suppose they were quite influential. I liked that stripped back style of filmmaking. And in a contemporary sense, I would have to say Ken Burns, who, is the great American historian slash filmmaker. And Ken is interesting because Ken makes history films in a very straight, very traditional, no frills fashion. And in the United States, there's a place for it. And he's, the role that he plays, both as a historian and a filmmaker, is accepted and acknowledged. We don't actually have that in Australia. We
Mm.
don't tend to like to make straight history documentaries. And I'm hoping that the streaming era will change some perspective on that. I don't think it's an audience perspective problem. I think it's a broadcaster perspective problem. I think the broadcasters just have got it in their head that they can't invest in traditional history documentaries.
Mm.
And I think that's a shame.
It is a shame. Almost worth setting up a new channel somewhere, just called the Hist. Well, there is a history channel I know on Foxtel, but it's having a separate one on Australian stories, history, and whatever. Anyway,
I think that would be very popular, I suspect.
I think it would be, and we do need to continue to tell our stories, and that's so
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be all about audience numbers and
Mm.
the metrics around how these things work. We've got a pretty small domestic television audience in Australia, and that sometimes affects our ability to tell some of our own stories. I think there is room to do things in a more traditional storytelling fashion.
Absolutely, fully agree with you. We've been speaking to Andrew Hyde, the director of 20 to the Mile, which will be shortly released on a streaming service. And Andrew, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Peter, thanks very much for having me. We really appreciate getting the message out.
Absolutely. All the best. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.